Time again for Doc Jacques, your Addiction Lifeguard podcast. I am Dr. Jacques de Bruckert, a psychologist, licensed professional counselor, and addiction specialist. If you are suffering from addiction, misery, trauma, whatever it is, I'm here to help. If you're in search of help to try to get your life back together, join me here at Doc Jacques, your Addiction Lifeguard, the Addiction Recovery Podcast. I wanted to be real clear about what this podcast is intended for. It is intended for entertainment and informational purposes, but not considered help. If you actually need real help and you're in need of help, please seek that out. If you're in dire need of help, you can go to your nearest emergency room, or you can check into a rehab center or call a counselor like me and talk about your problems and work through them. But don't rely on a podcast to be that form of help. It's not. It's just a podcast. It's for entertainment and information only. So let's keep it in that light, all right? Have a good time, learn something, and then get the real help that you need from a professional. You know, THC today isn't the same as what your parents or more likely your grandparents used to call pot. It's weed. But what used to be at about a 2 to 4% THC level plant has turned into a chemical concentrate reaching 90% potency. That's way different than it used to be. That's not a mild buzz. That's a neurochemical storm coming at you. And that's what I wanted to talk about today, was the much debated topic of, like, what are we calling THC stuff today, and why it is so dangerous and deadly and causing so many problems. So let's kind of set this up with an understanding of kind of what we're talking about. So THC is the chemical compound. It's the primary psychoactive compound in cannabis plants. It binds to the CB1 receptors in the brain and the CB2 receptors in the immune system. Both. And so both parts of that endocannabinoidal system, the ECS, it regulates pain, mood, appetite, memory, and that's the effect that it has when you're getting high. It's affecting those things, right? So you're feeling different about things. You get, the effects of it. I got the munchies. I feel kind of mellowed out. I'm not feeling pain. My memory is kind of disappearing on me. So the ECS naturally uses that. So this cannabinoid system that we have internally, which regulates mood, pain, appetite, memory, that's the ECS. It naturally uses internal cannabinoids. So it uses these internal cannabinoids to maintain that balance of the mood, pain, appetite, memory. When you introduce THC externally, you're smoking it, you're ingesting it, it overactivates the ECS. So it disrupts normal regulation. And so you become more of, whatever. So that's when the mood and the appetite and the memory and the pain and all of that gets all kind of thrown out of whack, because you're throwing off the internal neuroreceptors that we have, because you're introducing more of that THC than we have in our bodies. And we have THC in our bodies naturally. So, but the bigger problem is not that. It's the change in the THC levels. That's the thing that is becoming so problematic. So in the 1960s and 70s, the average cannabis, it was 2 to 4% THC. And so very low potency. In the 1990s, they had figured out how to get the potency up in that THC level of the plants. So the strains were averaging about 6%. In the 2020s, vape oils, dabs, shatter, these potency levels were reaching 60 and 90%. And that's where the problem lies, is in the increase in the levels, because we're getting a whole different thing happening. So cannabis use disorder, it's defined in our diagnostic statistical manual, the DSM-5 TR. It's a pattern of cannabis use causing clinically significant impairment or distress. And it meets, there's 11 criteria. You got to meet 2 or more within 12 months. Tolerance, withdrawal, unsuccessful attempts to cut down, cravings and neglect of obligations, and different things like that. It's the typical addiction kind of diagnostic criteria we use, but it's 2 out of the 11, which is not many compared to some of the other drugs. So and that's what we use to diagnose. So we're defining it by addiction or abuse, right? So the impact on you as a person. So the addiction mechanism that's going on there, THC triggers dopamine. It releases in the mesolimbic reward pathway. So it's triggering this dopamine release. And the repeated use desensitizes those dopamine receptors. So it produces a tolerance and a need for higher amounts of the THC. When you're getting high levels to begin with, your tolerance is going to be competing against, so to speak, the amount of the levels of the THC in the products that you're using. Withdrawal. The withdrawal symptoms, huge problem there. Irritability, sleep disturbance, decreased appetite, anxiety, vivid dreams when you're withdrawing. 2 to 3 days after you stopped. Might go as long as 7. I've heard as long as 10. Some of my clients are complaining about these things going on. And sleep disturbance actually can go on for a year after you stopped. And I'm going to go into reasons why in a little bit. But so the brain and the body on THC, what happens to that? Now, again, understand, I mean, I'm competing against another voice that people hear, which is it's natural, it's a plant-based thing, and so, hey, what's the big deal? You know, well, so is heroin, so is hash, so is cocaine. Other drugs are out there that are horribly bad. And it's funny because the defense of it's a natural product, you would never apply that to cocaine. You would never apply that to heroin. Well, it comes from poppy seeds. Cocaine comes from the coca plant. You would not associate that with, hey, it's natural. It's a plant. What's the big deal? I never have heard that as a defense for the usage of those drugs, but I do hear it with marijuana. And that's I think it's the old hippie, Cheech and Chong hippie thing of like, hey man, it's just a plant. What's the big deal? Well, so is alcohol, and so is heroin, and so is cocaine, and they're problems. They're huge problems. And nobody ever disagrees with me on that one. But what happens to the brain and the body when you're on THC products? Well, here's part of the issue. We couldn't study THC legally in our country, in the United States, because it was a banned substance. So you couldn't do laboratory experiments. You couldn't do double-blind experiments. You couldn't do any actual clinical research. You could only ask, if you ask somebody, hey, are you using this? Yes, no. But we had no idea how much they were using. We couldn't go into that level of research. But when they started legalizing it, we could. In Colorado, that was a gift to science community because now we can verify what we had thought all along. And it was actually worse than we thought. But so here, let me just go over some of the problems that happen in the body and the brain with THC. Let's go through them point by point. Cognitive impact. Short-term memory impairment, slow processing speed, difficulty with executive functioning, making decisions. It's the frontal cortex functioning, cognitive impact. Neuroimaging, when you take an fMRI and it shows reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. These are significant parts of our brain that really make us who we are as individuals. So when you've got somebody who's using THC products and you do an fMRI neural imaging, you can see that there is greatly reduced activity in that prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus area. And so then that's going to affect decision making and who you are. Like your personality is right there in the front of your brain. Motivational effects, that reduced response leads to anti-motivational syndrome. That's what we call it. Loss of drive, goal-directed behavior. I have many clients that come in here who are using THC regularly and ongoing, and there's no drive. There's no drive there. The psychiatric risk, it can induce acute psychosis and exacerbated latent schizophrenia. We know this. We've known this for a while. But the problem, when they were studying that, they started studying that back in 2002, 2003. But the level of psychosis is frightening. And it's with lower and lower age groups. I have clients who are teenagers I get parents that are calling me while they're taking their kid who's 15, 16, 17 years old, and they're having a psychotic break in the car on the way to the emergency room, and the parent has absolutely no idea what's going on. And the only thing that shows up on a tox screen at the hospital is THC, because that's what they used. And they report this to me. They'll say, all I did was just, I ate some edibles, or I was using my dab pen, and I don't know what happened. It was like they just went into this psychotic break, and that's the only thing they were using. Sleep disruption. Sleep disruption is a huge problem. Let me go back, because I really want to emphasize this. Schizophrenia, latent schizophrenia, later than normal. So schizophrenia normally starts showing up at between 18 and 25, and there's a risk increase of, especially if you have a family history of psychosis. Let me see if I can remember the research. It was 5 times the amount of risk, especially with those with a family of psychosis, if you're using THC products. 5 times. The sleep disruption thing, that's a huge problem. I have reports of clients who, they initially thought they were using THC products to help them go to sleep, only to find out that it's just making it worse, and they're confused, And the sleep disturbance has another side to it. So you stop using THC products. Maybe you go to a rehab, and you've been using your edibles or dabs or doing shatter or whatever, and you get there and you can't sleep. And you were doing other drugs. Maybe you're drinking. Maybe you're in there for like drugs and alcohol, or maybe multiple drugs. You got cocaine or heroin, fentanyl, something, and you're using THC products on top of that, and you're using a lot of it. Withdrawal, you have this horrible rebound dream intensity thing that comes up, and that's one of the problems with the sleep disruption is the dreams. You wake up, you're having a horrible dream, nightmare, it's too intense, and you're just waking up. Now you go through a couple of days of that, and then you're afraid to go to sleep. So it's a huge problem. In addition to the up to a year of sleep disturbance, just either waking up in the middle of the night or having a hard time going to sleep, that goes through withdrawal that seems to be the thing that lasts the longest. So there's a huge impact that use of THC has on people, and they would like to ignore it, and many of them do, but that's just the reality. Psychosis, latent schizophrenia, memory problems, impairment. Now remember, I'm not talking about 1960s, 1970s stereotypical hippie who's just smoking a joint and having a good time, and it's not a big problem. We didn't see any of this before. Now with the new forms of THC, we're seeing it, and we're seeing it in the worst forms possible. So that's because there's a change. So what do we have? We got new things in THC: vapes, edibles, dabs. It's a huge change in how you're ingesting it and the amount that you're getting, the uptake of it, how fast it occurs. In some instances, the delay of and then a quick uptake. So let me explain this, especially if you're listening to this and you don't really understand much about THC. Perhaps you're not using it. Maybe your family member who's listening to this and trying to figure this out. So you got oils, vape oils. They contain all kinds of solvents, residues, synthetic cutting agents that are in it. So the vape oils are what you're getting in when you're vaping the vape pen. They had to make it liquid, right? So they had to have this solvent to get it there, and then they have to cut it. So they're doing different things like vitamin E, acetate, which is linked to EVALI, lung injury. Sometimes we don't even know what is in that. There's no requirement to list every single thing in that vape pen. And even if they do, I mean, we're finding that it's just, it's out there. One of my clients went to a convenience store, and he is a THC addict who's in recovery. And he walked into a convenience store, and there was dab pens that had 50,000 units of THC in the dab pen, in a single dab pen. And he was shocked when he saw that. He was like, man, if I picked that up, I could just get as high as a kite just so quick, and it's 50,000 units of THC. Wow. Vape oils are, seriously, it could be just a vape pen that has nothing in it, or it has a vape oil or a THC oil in it. And if you're seen using it, nobody's going to know. They can't smell it. They don't know it's any other vape. It could be any other kind of vape oil. Grape vape oil, with THC in it. Edibles, here's another thing. Okay, so the clients that I have that use THC products, they run into trouble with edibles. Edibles have a delayed onset, 1 to 2 hours. Once you've consumed it, it takes 1 to 2 hours before it hits you. And so a lot of times what I see is people using edibles. They don't feel like they're getting high. So they eat more. Well, now you've way overconsumed. Or you have no real idea about how much you're consuming. So you take too much, but it's going to be a couple of hours perhaps before you'd even know. It can cause panic attacks, vomiting, hallucinations, because the THC, it's a delayed onset. And if you're overconsuming, you end up with THC toxicity, which really results in the things I'm talking about, the panic and the vomiting, the hallucinations, the psychosis type things. Dab pens, it's like a little heated metal tip end pen, and you're inhaling the smoke that the dab pen is melting the wax. So these concentrations, 60-90%, deliver massive amounts of THC instantly. So rapid tolerance and dopamine blunting happen really quickly with this. So if you're using a dab pen and you want to really kind of fry your brain quick, man, that's the way to do it. Then we have the other things that are so much fun. The synthetic THC, spice, K2, stuff like that. Full CB1 agonists, 100 times stronger than natural THC. But it doesn't necessarily show up on a test. And then you're going to have other things that are like way worse because it's so much stronger than natural THC. Seizures, stroke, psychosis. I have a client who's had multiple strokes caused by synthetic THC they ingested unknowingly. And they have permanent brain damage from that. They have no short-term, no long-term memory. And it's very, very difficult for them to live. And as a 24-year-old, that's a sad thing because you're not getting it back. So they went from fully functioning normal person to kind of vegged out because of that. I think that person had 4 strokes and was in a coma for about a month. Came out and could remember very little of anything. It can't retain information. either. Just can't retain it. How to get home from down the street from their house kind of thing. It's very sad. So there are a lot of things that can happen on the usage, but I wanted to talk also about like what are the mental health link here with THC usage, because a lot of people are using it because, hey, it's better than using heroin, or hey, it's relaxing me, or hey, it's helping me sleep. Okay, but chronic THC use correlates with incredibly higher rates of major depressive disorder and panic disorder, which is interesting because they're using THC because they're trying to relieve these things, right? But it causes them, and we know that. We know that from the research. So depression and anxiety, psychosis. The meta-analysis shows daily high-potency THC use increases psychosis risk by 5 times. So daily usage of high-potency THC. Now, that's not the person who's using it once a month or once a week, but somebody who's a wake and bake person. Yeah, they have 5 times the risk of psychosis. That's frightening. Not sure when you're using it because you're treating depression and anxiety that you're feeling or panic disorder, how that's going to help you. The trauma interaction, it dampens the amygdala activity. That's the part of the brain where there's emotional response to threat, right? Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. That's the amygdala. Short-term arousal, but long-term it reinforces avoidance and dissociation. You're not having a true trauma response process with that. So things that are happening to you, you're not. It's preventing the true trauma response. You're having an artificial experience in the amygdala because it dampens it, it tamps it down, it makes it so that your amygdala doesn't activate, and so the emotional arousal is very short term. In other words, if somebody is doing something and it's very traumatic, they're not responding to it like a normal person who's not getting high all the time with THC. But trust me, once you stop using that, you're going to have that response. And now you're going to have a really weird process of trying to experience past trauma without having had the initial response to it. It makes it very difficult to treat people that have traumatic lives, and now they're coming off of THC and they got to deal with it in today's world versus yesterday when you were experiencing it. With adolescents, you have another problem. Prefrontal and limbic systems, the regions are still developing in 25. So when we talk about, the frontal cortex is not fully online. Well, it's online. It's just not really filtering information the same because it's not really done developing. This is why we get personality disorders that pop up later in life relative to teenagers. So schizophrenia, psychosis, that kind of thing kicks in later on, right? But these areas that are developing, when you expose them to THC, it alters the white matter connectivity and the reward sensitivity. And so you're altering brain function permanently. It's not temporary. And we know it's permanent because we've had enough time to be able to look at it. For 20 years, we've been looking at this. So we could look at teenagers that were using a lot of THC products, and we're able to determine the level of alteration and where they probably should be. So I guess all of that to say, I'm not an advocate of use of THC products, period. And today's THC products are way different than the ones from when I was a teenager back in the 70s. And certainly the 60s and 70s, a different time, I understand. But there's a different consideration because we keep pushing up the potency levels. They keep, like, the better high. So I'm not in favor of that. And I certainly don't like that when my clients are coming to me and they're in recovery for some other drug. heroin or alcohol, and they come in and they say, "Well, I'm clean. I'm clean. I'm not using heroin, and I'm in recovery." And I'm like, "Yeah, but you're using all the time." And one of the issues is, and I'm not. It's not just me saying it, because I have clients. For example, I have a client. Fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, THC products, alcohol, did it all at a young age, teenage years into 20-something, then started getting into recovery and went to college and had a really hard time because listening to all the nonsense that was coming out of people when they were talking about, hey, you know what, smoking pot's not that big of a deal. I'm in recovery from, I was doing heroin or I was doing cocaine and all, it's fine. And I'm doing weed. And this client that I had who experienced that was just outraged because they said that they understood the connection between the use of a drug and a chemical and the impact on your recovery. And that person was just horrified listening to these people talk about how innocuous and non-impactful THC products were. And this is a person who had one of the worst addictions I've encountered in my career and one of the more successful recoveries. And they just couldn't tolerate it, like listening to these people. So they couldn't go to meetings because every meeting was like, THC is fine as long as you're not drinking, you're okay. That's AA, right? The NA was the same thing, but it was always the primary drug of choice they weren't using, but it was fine that they were using THC products. Somehow that was fine. And they couldn't stand that idea, and they stopped going to meetings because of it until they were out of college. And now goes back out of the college environment, the kids who think they know everything, but they just don't look at facts and science, and they don't listen to experts. So what do you do? Well, you know what? You can't be mastered by anything. And I think that THC is mastering you if you're using it, and you're using it daily or multiple times a week. Part of me is like, hey man, you want to smoke pot, you want to use weed, you want to use THC products, have at it, but understand it's a drug and you're addicted, and it's going to be a problem when you're trying to get off of it. Now, if it's legal, that's fine, but guess what? That doesn't mean you can drive and be high, and you can't be at work and be high, and employers are going to test you, and if you test positive, you're going to get fired. THC is a fat-soluble chemical, and so it stays in your fat cells. Well, it stays in your fat cells until you express it out. Well, so you could be testing positive for months. If you're a wake and bake guy, it could be months, and you're going to be testing positive. So guess what? You're going to end up getting fired. If you're driving a car and you're driving erratically, and they do a blood test and they see that the metabolites are showing a high level of output of THC, even if you haven't used anything for, 2 or 3 days, you're going to get popped for driving while intoxicated because you were driving erratically. Now, were you driving erratically because your steering linkage was loose in your car or because you were impaired? It doesn't matter because you tested positive. The thing I've talked to my friends who are psychiatrists, and I'm like, hey, what do you think about this as a treatment for anxiety or panic disorder, or THC edibles or dab pens or whatever? What do you think? And they're like, no, because we have no way of knowing how much they're using, and that's the problem. And so I can't advise that, as I've heard this from every single psychiatrist I've worked with. Can't really advise that. So it's like there's no good way to treat that. It's like treating I'm treating anxiety by drinking alcohol. Well, that's not a treatment. First of all, it's not treating the condition. It's treating the symptom. So if you have anxiety, you have panic attack, and you're using a chemical, you're treating the symptom. You're not treating the actual condition. Think about that when you're using. If you're using recreationally and you are the person who has bought into the 420s and the idea of like it comes from a plant. Understand that so does alcohol, so does cocaine, so does heroin. Fentanyl is a chemical replication of heroin, just in a more intense form, put together in a laboratory. That doesn't make it okay. So these are problems, and you're just kidding yourself if you think that it's not a problem. That's like the alcoholic who drinks every day because he has anxiety. Yeah, but you're drinking every day. What are you doing for the anxiety? You're treating the symptom of the anxiety. What's causing it? So if you're not out there actually working on those things, then you're really just you're kicking the can down the road. And unfortunately, if you're just kicking a bad decision can down the road, that's one thing. When you're kicking a chemical, using a chemical to kick it down the road, that chemical is going to get you eventually, and it's going to cause problems. And it pains me because I've seen many of my clients over the last, I want to say 5 years, report that they've had psychotic episodes. The one that had the, multiple strokes and was in a coma for a month, and came out with severe brain damage. It's just, these are not good things. And so, yeah, it's legal because politicians want to make money, and they see tax revenue that is coming from the usage and the sales of THC products. I'm sorry. Politicians don't make good decisions for everybody. They're making decisions based on, I can figure out a way to make more money to grow the government, or perhaps I'm being contributed to in my campaigns to give me a very high-paying political job by some lobbyists. And that's a problem. Just my 2 cents on THC. So the good and the bad, it is possible to heal from this, but, you got to get support. If you have these issues of anxiety and depression, and those are the two that people come to me with, and they say, oh, yeah, I'm using because of that. Fine. How about you get real treatment for it and stop screwing around with, like, addressing the symptoms? You wouldn't, oddly enough, the biggest advocates for the use of marijuana because it's quote-unquote natural are the people who refuse to take mood stabilizers and antidepressants. But yet they don't have a problem with using a chemical in the form of THC for the rest of their life, apparently. None of that makes sense to me. So there are better ways. And those better ways are to get help. So if you need help, please go to rehab. Get the help. Reach out to a counselor. Go to your nearest emergency room if you need to. But whatever it is, man, get into treatment, because being high and strung out and losing your life is not the way to go. If you're protecting your addiction by losing your life, what are you gaining? This is nonsense. So get the help. It's frustrating when you're there, but if you're listening to these podcasts, you're already sort of getting the help that you're looking for a little bit, but let's go all the way. Get clean, sober, and sane and stable. It's a better life. It's a better life. Not a life. Until then, this is Doc Jacques, your addiction lifeguard, saying, see ya.